Everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's edition of You're Leaving Again. I'm Laura, your USO host, and we are so excited for today's topic. It's actually the most requested topic to date, and it's on intimacy, especially intimacy from a distance. So we have an hour for today's event, so we're going to get started right away. I'd love to introduce you to Corie and Matt Weathers. They are here today to talk about this topic and lead us through the discussion. And I will be joining you in the chat box, and I will come back on at the end. Thank you, Corie and Matt, for being with us today.
Thank you, Laura. Hey, everybody. We are so excited about today's topic, and we are going to dive in really fast, actually. But before we do, I'm just going to do a quick introduction, just in case you have not been following our series yet, and this is the first time you're joining us. I'm Corie, my husband Matt on the screen there as well. We're going through a deployment, so that's why we're in two different locations. And the USO has been following us during our deployment. And we really decided together in this partnership of doing this series that we wanted to address real topics that we go through, but we also know that you guys go through in a very authentic way, and really talk about some of the tough stuff too. And so as we are going through our deployment, we're covering various topics that we're going through, and we know that you guys do as well. And so if you're just joining us for the first time, we did a series episode right before he left, and then honestly the day after he left, and then we did one last month on parenting. And you can have access to all of these recorded webinars after the fact on the USO dashboard that we'll share with you definitely at the end. So you have that link. You probably saw the dashboard already when you're registered, perhaps. And so just know that you'll be able to access this again. And if this is helpful to you, maybe for your spouse, if they're not able to watch it, you can share it with your spouse later. And so we're excited to cover this topic. Like Laura said, it's a very big topic. So first I want to say hi to Matt. They're deployed.
Hey, what's happening?
We're covering a tough topic. I know you usually start off with hi, by the way. It's always fun to see him on Zoom. You know, we tried to talk before the event too, but I know you kind of always have your little spiel that you have to do before we get going. Do you want to do that again?
No, I'm good.
Like all things expressed are yours and yours alone.
Oh, that, yes. Okay, yeah. Yes. Hi, my name is Matthew Weathers. I'm a United States Army chaplain. Any views or opinions or things that I say are firmly mine and do not represent the United States government, the Department of Defense, the United States Army, or any unit to which I may or may not be affiliated.
There you go. There you go. So no, this is a super big topic on intimacy. And so we only have an hour with you guys today, and you've submitted some great questions that we're going to definitely get to as well. And I want to just remind you that in your registration, you should have gotten a listening guide, a PDF listening guide. And we're going to lean on that guide pretty heavily, at least for the first part of today, because there is some amazing content. It's like some of Matt and my favorite resources, especially on this topic, is in that listening guide. And there's some really important points that are in there that I hope will help you. And so I just want to draw attention to that in case you can pull it up or make sure you look for it afterwards as well. So we're going to touch on intimacy, and intimacy in a military relationship is definitely a challenge, especially when you're talking about deployments, trainings, if you are geo-batching. I would love to know and see you guys in the chat. Let us know if you're either if you're going through a military initiated separation right now. Put that in the chat. Tell us if you are geo-batching, if you're on an unaccompanied tour. Tell us what's going on in your world. You don't have to be military separated right now to participate today, because I think it's such a huge topic. But let me know. And then also, I'm a clinician. I'm a counselor that works with military and first responder couples. And I will say that this is one of the number one topics that comes into the counseling office. It's kind of up there with external family members, and finances and communication, which we're going to be addressing next month, is some of the biggest topics and what we would sometimes call hot topics for couples, especially for service couples, because it's difficult enough to have a marriage, right? And to work on your marriage. But then when you go through being separated and you have to figure out how to grow as a couple while separated, it's even more challenging. And so, like Laura said, we've gotten a lot of really great questions on that. So I'm seeing a lot of people deployed. First deployment almost done. Wife is deployed. We've got a Navy family. This is fantastic. Thank you guys for sharing what's happening in your world. So hopefully this is going to really resonate for a lot of you guys. So Matt, we're going to talk about intimacy. We're going to talk about how you stay connected. And, you know, I don't know if you guys saw the funny video that Matt did. I thought it was so fun. But he did a great job basically saying, we're going to cover a lot of things today, not just sexual intimacy, although that's a big question. And that reminds me, if you are listening to this and there are little ones running around, perhaps you put some earphones in or go someplace, let them watch TV, do something where little ears are not listening, because there are going to be some choice words that we are going to be using appropriately today that you might want to make sure you have some earphones in as well. So, so excited, Matt, to talk with you about this. I know in my practice, I get a lot of questions on sexual intimacy, especially from females for sure. It can definitely be an issue. Sexual intimacy just in marriage in general can be a big issue for a lot of couples, especially military couples. If you've had any kind of trauma in your background, if you're on medications, there's just a lot of things, kids, work, all kinds of things can interfere with your intimacy and the time that you guys spend together. It can interfere with your emotional intimacy, your connection that you feel with your spouse, but also the physical changes that go through both of our bodies, male and female, over time, or because of things that you're going through at various seasons of your life can impact physical intimacy as well. So I know you say the word sex and everybody signs up, right? Everybody signs up for an event. And we have like 40 people that are watching right now, which I think is fantastic. And so I've said a lot. Matt, anything that you want to say before we kind of jump in?
No, I think that that is a hot topic. That and finances are the two hot topics in marriages. And there's a lot to be said before discussing physical intimacy. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be talked about and discussed. We live in a culture nowadays that it seems to, I think it's always presented it as a more accessible and easier aspect to a relationship than it actually is. And that's because there are so many things which must be said before you actually get to that. And it leads me to one of my favorite Greek words in the world, which is, it's called prolegomena. And it literally means words that must be said before. So before we jump all the way into the topic that I think everybody showed up for, let's really figure out what are the foundational aspects that lead up to that. What are the things that have to be present? It's not just you don't bake a cake with one ingredient, right? You have to have all these other ingredients in the right amounts in order for that cake to turn out well. So when we were going through, when Corie and I, as we've been talking about it, within our own marriage, as we've been helping other people in their marriages, we looked at it in multiple different ways, just kind of turning it around to see the different forms of intimacy that married couples can celebrate, and that sometimes need to be acknowledged so that you can see that you're winning in a lot of areas. Because sometimes physical intimacy is an area where people, to be honest, feel like neither person is actually getting a win. And it can cause frustration, it can cause anxiety, and that just becomes, it creates that much more complexity to the issue. And I don't say a problem because it's not a problem, all right? Because it's two people who want to be connected in a very safe and secure space. They want to be able to celebrate that. They want to bring their vulnerable self to one another. So Corie, went on the handout, you've got the different types of intimacy. So what if we start and just talk about that, and then we'll talk through the four kind of characteristics that have to be present in a relationship to be able to enjoy intimacy in each one of those areas.
Yeah. And let me just say kind of from the beginning that intimacy is this connection. Some people like the phrase, if you've not heard it before, into me see, like I see you and you see me, like into my soul. And that is what intimacy, a good way to describe intimacy. It's a longing, a connection, a wanting to be close in a variety of ways. And I also want to acknowledge that while there are many, many, many couples that struggle with this area, it's also okay if this is not an area that you struggle with in your marriage. I think that Matt and I talk about this a lot as far as we believe that, in most couples, there's usually one topic. Like it's like one topic that is like the topic that you guys really struggle with. And we really believe that one topic, whatever it is, and maybe you have more than just one. And I think it also depends on what season of marriage you're in. But that there's usually one topic that you really have a hard time seeing eye to eye, and that there can be a lot of potential conflict in it. And we believe that one topic that every couple has at least is there to keep you humble, to keep you curious, to keep you ever growing and searching for ways to find that intimacy. And I think in marriage, that's really scary when you come across a topic that you're not seeing eye to eye on and you don't know how to connect and you really want that intimacy, but it's just not fitting together really well. And I think that kind of scares a lot of couples when really it's not that your marriage is falling apart. It's just, like Matt said, you really long to be connected and resolve that issue between the two of you. And you're going to have to work really hard to see a little bit more eye to eye on that. But honestly, I think that there is these what we call perpetual topics that may always be a struggle for a marriage. And it may be always something that you wrestle through. And honestly, after 22 years of marriage, thank goodness, because if we had it all figured out, there would be a lack of humility, a lack of curiosity, and not much growth happening in the relationship. And you probably would stop trying to work so hard on communication. And so it is hard, but it's there to make you keep growing. And so when we talk about what is intimacy, it is longing to be closer, longing to be more connected, and that everybody does that in different ways, and everybody seeks relationships for different things and seeks relationships or seeks the closeness in different ways. And so on your handout, there is, I want to say it's page three or four technically, but I gave you a list of different intimacy types. And here's the thing, guys. There are lots of different kinds of intimacy. Experts out there say there is anywhere between 5 and 40 different kinds of intimacy, different ways to create intimacy in your relationship. But for some reason, we all jump to sexual intimacy, physical intimacy as like the best way for a couple to connect. And it is a very unique way. And it's a way that can create a lot of hurt if you aren't loyal to each other. And if you're inviting other people into your relationship, it can create the most destructive hurt and pain in your relationship. And in a future part of this series, Matt and I are going to be talking about how to recover from deep wounds like that. However, thank goodness that there are several different kinds of intimacy, because couples go through various seasons and different stages of your body even. Medications can cause dysfunction. Not knowing your body can cause dysfunction. There's a lot of things that can make physical intimacy more challenging or stressful. And so that's why it's actually a great thing that there are many different kinds of ways that you can connect and find intimacy as a couple. And so I'm going to just kind of name a few of them out there. And what I would love for you guys to do, we are going to cover sexual intimacy, so just stick with us. But I'm going to just kind of rattle off a few of these different types of intimacy. And I want to see in the chat box if any of these types of intimacy are ones that you kind of lean towards, other than just sexual intimacy, right? So we've already mentioned financial intimacy, like you can experience, I believe it or not, you can bond as a couple over your goals financially, over saving money together. There's a lot of people who maybe grow up with a background of struggling with finances or grow up in poverty. And so finances become a place of like security and safety. And so being able to save money, spend money as a couple, talk about money as a couple can be a form of intimacy that you grow and work together in. You definitely can relate, I'm sure, that if there's any kind of betrayal or secrecy or something that you're not together on financially, that it can disrupt your intimacy, right? So sometimes you can know that this is a form of intimacy because if you've ever experienced the challenge of when there's not the closeness and connection there, or not the good communication there, that it disrupts your relationship, that's kind of a good sign that it's probably an area that you can also create intimacy in if you build that trust in there as well. So there's financial intimacy. Emotional intimacy is a really big one. I'm going to stereotype here and put people in a box. Typically, women really lean towards that emotional intimacy. We talk a lot about how women need to feel safe emotionally, feel secure emotionally with their spouse before sex. And so emotional is something that, yes, Matt.
I was going to do the next three.
Okay.
After you're done.
Yeah, I absolutely. And so women typically need to have that emotional security, feeling like they are seen, loved, adored, appreciated, seen like into the depths of my soul before they get to a place of comfortability for physical intimacy. Again, we're stereotyping here. Everybody is different. So emotional intimacy is one we hear a lot. Matt, you want to go through the next three?
Yeah, so work intimacy, intellectual, and recreational. I tend to think that those are intimacies that tend to be associated more with a masculine kind of approach to life, I guess. Maybe at least for myself as a male, as a man, work intimacy really speaks to my not just a vocation, but it's an expression of who I am in the world. It's a living out. And one of the great things is I've been able to watch Corie be able to express who she is to the world and to be able to live out her vocation. And at the same time, I've also watched her frustration as a military spouse with the difficulty moving job to job to job, place to place to place, having to constantly reinvent herself. And one way that we said we're going to share tips and tricks. One tip that I can definitely give you is that I have received back in my love language, like quality time from Corie, when I have invested in her and in that work intimacy to go, okay, no, we're either going to spend this extra money in order to be able to put you where you need to be, whether that's credentialing, whether that's things for podcasting. I'm going to champion that. This may be a season where I don't have to work as much, and I'm good to kind of just to do the job and do the job very well, but not go above and beyond, limit the hours as much as possible so that I can be there for her and to be able to share those burdens. But I know that's been an important area for both of us to respect each other as professionals and for us to really honor that. And that's that work intimacy that we have. There's intellectual intimacy, which is definitely an area that we've shared, which is both have a passion for people and for psychological things. He is actually a passionate learner than I am. So he goes. I don't know if I'm still frozen or not.
Yeah, you're frozen. But I will say, can I just jump in while I'm waiting for you to
actual intimacy, that ability to share ideas, to share thoughts, and to be able to connect in that way is very important. But then recreational intimacy. So all the
So I see myself frozen. I don't know. Laura, can you jump in and let me know if I'm frozen as well, or is it just Matt's side?
It's just Matt's side.
Okay. So let me jump in while we're waiting for him to come back. He is deployed, guys, right? This is exactly a perfect thing for intimacy because this is like the challenge, right, of doing this apart from each other is that you're trying to connect. And I was actually going to say, when he mentioned work intimacy, our ability to teach together as a couple and doing events like this, like that is a huge part of our intimacy together, is that we love teaching together. We have this dance that we do when we're in person together and teaching together that I know what he's thinking and he knows what I'm thinking. And we have this wonderful dance of working together. And that's something that brings us great joy. And so that's a form of intimacy for us, is work intimacy. But yes, he was also, I see you there, Matt. You were also talking about intellectual intimacy is one that we love to talk about psychological topics. And I will also say, oops, sorry, I hit my mic. I will also say that recreational intimacy is a huge, important one for me. Because I have such a serious job of counseling, I have over time realized that I need opportunities to play, get outside, do something exciting, do something adventurous, and want to be able to do that with him and share that with him. And that has over time grown for me as a form of intimacy of things that we can do together. I see you're back. Hi.
Hi. So am I on?
Yeah, I think you're good. I think you're good.
Yeah.
I might end up doing this one by myself, guys.
Like, I guess going downhill.
I think it is. I'm going to keep talking until you're back fully. We definitely talked about this ahead of time, so I know what he would say. So I'm going to go quickly through these types. I want you guys to still put them in the chat box, which intimacy types stand out for you. Parenting, believe it or not, parenting is an intimacy. Here's the thing. If you have to do something or want to do something with your spouse and it's better for you guys to do it together as a team, there's going to be an element of intimacy there. So again, if you're finding frustration with your spouse because you're not quite working together on something very well, it's probably a sign that it's a place of intimacy. And it also changes up. Here's somebody said that they're really excited about the communication talk that we're going to do. Here's like a little nod to what some of what we'll share for the communication thing. If you are saying, let's say struggling with the parenting side of things, and you feel like you're not quite sharing as like a team member with your spouse on parenting, it's a totally different kind of conversation to go to your spouse and say, hey, I really want to parent well with you. I really want to feel close and connected in our parenting together. I want us to be on the same team together. And when we aren't on that team together, I feel disconnected from you. I feel like there's something off between us. And that's a totally different conversation compared to fighting over who's right in how you choose to parent. And so that's why parenting is actually a form of intimacy. There's goal setting. A lot of couples work together with setting goals together, planning your future, talking about retirement. There's an intimacy. Matt and I have been sharing, like, he's been sending me pieces of land to look at just to dream about our future and retirement. And like, there's an intimacy there. There's like I can't wait to sit on that porch with you in a rocking chair or whatever. And to dream that with you, that there's intimacy in those kind of conversations. Matt, do you want to cover spiritual intimacy? I know that's
yeah. So early, I'm a chaplain, and Corie and I were both raised in a home of faith. And even it's interesting because we had a lot of tension early on in our marriage because our expression of our own personal faith was very different. We had the same faith, but just the way that we lived it out and the way that we expressed it. And what you'll see with all of these different forms of intimacy and connection is that we learn them from our family of origin, whether or not we learn it and go, I want to model that, or I definitely don't want to model that. So when you start backtracking, everybody makes fun of being on a psychologist's couch and then thinking like, so what were your parents like? And but it really does go back to your experience, how you best received love, and in the way that you experience the world in a very safe and secure manner. And so as children, we naturally gravitate towards that. And so when, especially with spiritual intimacy, the experiences that you have early on, for good or for bad, can influence you in that way, in the way that you approach, I tell people, the way that you approach the concept of a transcendent, something other than us. Whether that's just strictly you sense a larger connection to the world in general or to a higher power. Either one is the ability to share that, to be able to open that up. And when we look at all these different forms of intimacy, obviously my Wi-Fi has been spotty, so I don't know if you've said this or not, but it probably bears repeating that we pursue these areas in order to test out and feel safe and secure and connected. And we're going to say that over and over and over again, because if there's anything you leave tonight with, I want you to leave with 4 words: safe, secure, connected, and vulnerable. Okay? Because that's the way that you're going to be able to go, okay, this, now I'm entering into an area of intimacy, maybe into, as Corie phrases it, a sacred space, and to be aware of it. So yeah, spiritual intimacy.
So there's like we said, there's between 5 and 40 different types, right? And so there's lots more. I even gave you places on your listening guide to have a conversation with your spouse about where do you think that your intimacy comes from, just to kind of clarify that just a little bit. We often go to our spouse and talk about our needs, right? Our need for intimacy. And so there's a difference between, I think, intimacy and needs. Needs, if you've listened to anything that I've covered, I talk a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm not going to break down today. But there are your basic needs: food, water, shelter, sex is in there, sleep. There's a need for love and belonging. There's a need for being able to grow and mature and find your purpose and your identity and find what you're good at. There's a basic need for beauty and wanting to be about nature and creating something in the world. Like those are your basic needs. But I want you to think about these intimacy types as kind of the lens through which we kind of meet our needs, right? So when you talk about a need for love and belonging, especially in marriage, then you're talking about, well, how do I approach my spouse and how do I feel loved? Some people call it the love languages. And I think that I like the 5 love languages, but I think that we can expand past just the basic 5 love languages into these intimacy types and really change our conversation with our spouse a little bit more, because there are times where, for sure, I need financial intimacy with Matt. I need sexual intimacy with Matt. I need parenting intimacy. I need spiritual intimacy. There's all these different components that make you a complete human being, right? And being able to sit down with your spouse and go, like, where would you rank these of importance for you? Like, I would really strongly encourage you to sit down and, like, if you were to rank some of these, one to like the biggest expression of love in the way that you receive it, and listen to your spouse and know we tend to marry our opposites, and that your spouse is going to have some kinds of intimacy that you share and you do this great dance with each other. But there's going to be a few that like are contrasting for each other. And so before we get into sexual intimacy, I just want to say, after you have this conversation of what are the different types of intimacy for the both of you, I really, really, really want you guys to walk away from today's talk and remember that your intimacy type and your spouse's main intimacy type, let's say, are deeply connected to each other. They are in a crazy cycle kind of way. They impact each other. They influence each other. And there's not just one way to find intimacy in your relationship. Again, like I said in the beginning, thank goodness there's not just one way, right? There's several ways, but it's important for you both to be able to acknowledge those really important ones and understand that they're connected, right? So if you are kind of chasing your spouse's love language, let's say, and your spouse is not returning and coming your direction, and it's maybe out of a misunderstanding that they don't maybe crave that kind of intimacy, they don't lean towards that kind of intimacy, that this should start a conversation for when you feel loved and taken care of. It of course makes you feel closer and connected to your spouse and wanting to lean their direction too. And they work together, they feed off of each other. I'm hoping that makes sense. Matt,
I think it makes perfect sense. And the image that I have is, when you go to a doctor and discuss nutrition, they always talk about not just healthy, but balanced, and that you've got to pick from all different food groups. They say you need to have vegetables that are every different color, and I always struggle because I only think, bell peppers are the only thing that are a different color, and I'm not going to eat all those different colors of bell peppers. So I guess I'll just, miss out on the orange and red stuff. But with these intimacies, you've got to have that balance to it in order for all of the rest of it to be going well.
And I would
for the rest of it to be healthy. So you can't just look. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if you're experiencing like a major issue in one area, take a good hard look at all the other areas that are not as difficult as that one area, and then figure out how are we going to come together in those areas. specifically financial intimacy. And I'll just pull that out and tease that out for a second. If you're having a difficulty coming together and feeling, safe with your finances together, take a hard look at what you both use finances for. Each one of these intimacies is a topic, it's an area, but it's something that we as humans use in order to interact with the world. Spiritually, we use spiritual intimacy to figure ourselves out, to figure the world out. Financially, we use it to find safety or security, to be able to create a level of predictability, to hedge our bets against the unpredictability of the world or the military, as it were. And so figure out what you're using that intimacy for, what kind of message you're trying to speak into your life with that. Because if you don't know what that message is, if you don't know why you're actually going to that area, you can't ever expect your spouse to be able to speak it well, because you haven't told them how to speak that language, or you don't even know why it matters. And so really it's just two blind people trying to figure their way out in the world when they don't even really know what matters, And it comes down with parenting. Every different season of parenting intimacy is different. Maybe life was great up until middle school. And then all of a sudden middle school, your issues start coming up as you watch your middle schooler going through middle school. And you're like, what changed? So you got to figure out, for yourself and be able to communicate with your spouse. It goes to one of the 4 points that we talked about. And if you want to move on to that, love, we can, which, is knowing yourself and knowing the other. And there's a couple of things in the way that we phrase that, knowing yourself is very important, because you can't expect anybody to be able to know you if you don't know you. You're responsible for being able to communicate adequately, to articulate effectively what things matter to you and why they matter. Why they matter is just, if not more important, because it enables another person to understand the depth of meaning within that part, right? But then to know the other. When I say the other, there's, it presumes that you're not enmeshed. When we talk about intimacy, too often I think people think about two people just becoming completely enmeshed and wrapped around one another, like the roots of two trees. And while that's a beautiful image, there can be too much enmeshment that doesn't allow for enough chemistry in some of these areas. And the playfulness that we all experience as we begin dating early on in our relationships. So you have to allow the other person to be an other than you, to be different. And part of that is to actually acknowledge the difference, to celebrate the difference at times, to be respectful of the difference, and to understand it. So know yourself, but also know the other and treat them as an other.
Yes. And so these are what we're covering right now. Here's how you build intimacy. So number one, emotional vulnerability and security. So it takes you, we use the word exposing yourself, and I'm not necessarily, although that includes like physical intimacy, it's also about like emotionally making yourself vulnerable. And even when you talk about like, I'll just use one that you would think is not a vulnerable thing, but like recreational intimacy, like to expose that part of you to say, I need to have fun. I need to play. That's a vulnerable conversation. It's still a vulnerable presenting yourself to your spouse to say, I'm kind of sharing this need with you, and the why behind it, like Matt was talking about. So in order to build more intimacy, whether it's sexual intimacy or any of these other ones, it requires that emotional vulnerability. It requires that knowledge of you and why you're feeling the way that you are, being able to communicate, knowing yourself. You could apply that physically. Like, it's very important that you know your body and know how your body works in order to make sex work, right? I can't tell you how many people I work with, and I'm normalizing this for anybody who's listening right now. I cannot tell you how many people I've worked with who struggle in the area of sex or sexual intimacy with their marriage because they grew up within a lifestyle where they just were not taught. And women, our culture, women, we don't teach other women. We don't teach the village about our bodies, how they work, or what we're supposed to do with them. And so women typically get married and then are trying to figure it out, or spend their adolescence trying to figure it out and still don't know. I was personally shocked when I was working with adolescent girls that even though they were going through being taught in school about their anatomy, that they still did not know it. So it's very important, even as parents, to be able to encourage just knowing yourself. And I'm not saying doing that in destructive ways, but it also means that if you're talking about emotional intimacy, that you know yourself well enough that you can communicate what it is that you need to communicate to your spouse. But it is also about you understanding and knowing your spouse or your partner. Again, that comes down to communication and hearing and having a willingness to learn, a willingness to listen, and a willingness to accept the fact that your spouse is different from you. It also requires a courageous and adventurous spirit. And that's really tough for some forms of intimacy if that feels unsafe for you. And we're going to answer a few of those questions here in just a minute. So I'm going to circle back to that courageous, adventurous here in a few minutes. But it does require that for building intimacy. You have to be willing to be curious. You have to be willing to stretch yourself just a little bit. You have to lean towards your spouse. And what they're saying is important to them. And that will always create a little bit of uncomfortability. We're not talking about swinging the pendulum to like unsafe and destructive things. We're talking about just a little bit of stretching that's happening. Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
I think it's funny now that, I mean, usually when we're teaching, I can just kind of nudge you.
I know.
And when I'm like, I just want to say a little something. Now I'm like, I have to raise my hand, teacher. So I'm like in high school Zoom class. Like I'd like to answer. I'd like to expand on courageous and adventurous spirit, but like a phrase just crossed my brain I wanted to share when you were talking about, figuring yourself out as a teenager or as a young adult for anybody that, is trying to understand themselves. Being sexualized is not the same as experiencing sexual intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so no one can equate the two, that just having had the experience doesn't mean that you actually experience the intimacy that is supposed to actually be there, to be able to be seen in that way. So just wanted to differentiate those two. And I think you said it eloquently and just wanted to kind of put a bow on it with that phrase. I love Brene Brown's explanation of courageous, which it literally means to tell your story with your whole heart. Okay. And so when you're telling your story with your whole heart, you're really putting yourself out there. And it goes back to knowing yourself and to be able to explain yourself and to be able to explain your why. So it's not just a matter of like going out and doing crazy things, like being, financially irresponsible. It's not just a matter of like being an irresponsible or an irrational parent. Really, it just means really digging deep and living your life out with your whole heart. If you're not doing that, you're not really kind of intimate with yourself, because you're kind of living that split life. And if you're not intimate with yourself in your heart, then you can't really be intimate with an other, because you don't really know what's going on there inside of you. So tell your story with your whole heart.
I was going to say, I think that's the most important statement that we could have said this whole webinar.
You're welcome.
Which again, to live wholeheartedly. And that when you find yourself really struggling with something, to even if you have to go get professional help to kind of understand what's blocking that. I do see a couple of your questions and statements in the chat. But I would love if you have an actual question that you can even send it to me directly so that I can understand what you're asking, because some of them are a little bit vague and I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. Okay. So I do want to cover, and we'll kind of expand on what we just said here in just a minute as we go through questions, but I do want us to cover some of the sexual intimacy parts of the listening guide that are really important. This is a collection of information that Matt and I have collected over time, but also from some of the leading sex experts that are out there, especially as it relates to military couples when you're spending time apart. So I'm going to kind of go through this quickly so we can get to some of our questions. But I just want to say, first of all, if you are spending almost half and half time apart and together with your spouse. There's a lot of couples that say to me, we've spent an equal amount of time married as we have apart, and that you are normal within the military culture. Can I just say that because a lot of couples are like, this is terrible. We're only spending like half of our time together. And I just want to say within the military culture, that is a more of the norm. And while that's really puts a burden and a challenge on us as military couples within our culture, it's not uncommon. And it requires a lot of creativity to stay connected in all these forms of different kinds of intimacy to especially make up for the times that you can't physically be present with each other. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to normalize that, first of all. I also gave you a quote from Dr. Doug Rosenau. We know him personally. Matt especially knows him personally. He's one of the leading experts in sex therapy, has an amazing book. I think it's called
Celebration of Sex.
Celebration of Sex. And that's a fantastic book, especially if you're trying to grow in that area and it's an area of uncomfortability for you. He is one of the leading experts out there. So here's a couple things that we want to definitely address, okay? Oxytocin, which is the hormone that is released at orgasm, is known as the connective hormone, okay? It is a hormone that is dumped into your system, yes, at orgasm, but also for nursing mothers. It is the bonding, connecting hormone. Did you know that oxytocin can be released if your spouse is just rubbing your feet? Right? That oxytocin can be released in a lot of ways. You can actually release oxytocin in your body from looking into your spouse's eyes. It is the hormone that is dumped into your system that makes you feel connected, that makes you feel close, that makes you feel seen. And it is an important hormone to all of these intimacy types, but especially in sexual intimacy. Matt and I recently got the subscription of Masterclass. If you guys have seen that on Facebook or whatever, I am like devouring all the masterclasses that are in there. But there's a great one on sexuality where she talks about how oxytocin is also contributes to pain relievers and endorphins that are dumped into your system. I mean, sex is supposed to be a connection. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be pleasurable, but it's also spiritual. And it's meant to be a place where it may not be easy all the time. And it's definitely not what you're going to see in Hollywood all the time. And it's definitely one of those most vulnerable places that you can encounter as a couple that requires both thinking of yourself and thinking about your spouse and trying to be present and trying to also think in your mind. And there's so many things happening at once. Of course, that's a lot of variables that even one going wrong can make it a very challenging moment. But just remember that oxytocin is a huge part of that. And so Dr. Michael Seitzma is one of our mentors and friends and colleagues. I shared in the listening guide that there's a podcast episode that I did with him where I actually covered even in more detail about how to recover from wounds in this area, but also how to connect when you're apart. And he talks about how oxytocin is one of those things that, like, even if you need to ask your spouse when you are together, like, hey, if you could rub my feet, if we could talk beforehand, it kind of like primes that oxytocin a little bit more to help you feel a little bit more connected. But it's a very important part. And if you aren't experiencing orgasms in sex, that's something for you to definitely, you are worth the investment of taking care of yourself and pursuing help in that area so that you can work on that, knowing yourself and growing more comfortable with that. So I'm just going to say that out loud. Okay. All right. Number 2, this is something that most people don't address. And you know what it feels like if you're in the military. And that is when you spend long times apart from your spouse and you've not had that secure, warm adult hug or physical affection from your spouse after long periods of time. Those of you who are deployed probably feel this even more. There's something actually called skin hunger. Skin hunger is that feeling when your skin is crawling because you haven't had the physical affection from your spouse in a really long time, and your body has grown accustomed to that affection. And now without it, you just feel like your skin is crawling, right? And just because you have toddlers around that are climbing all over you doesn't mean that you won't have skin hunger, right? But that's a normal reaction. That's a normal feeling and experience that you're going to have when you're spending long periods of time apart. So skin hunger is a real thing. If you didn't know about it, I'm sure you've felt it before. Okay, Maddie, good if I keep going and we'll jump into questions here in a second? Now we have a
Yeah,
delay.
you're the one that loves to fill in the blanks. So go ahead.
Okay. He's like, forget the fill in the blanks. Let's get to the questions. All
You
right.
good? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Here's a really important
Yeah.
one. Here's a really important one. Women tend to crave sex less with each day that passes without physical intimacy. Okay. This has been researched by the leading sex and marriage experts out there that the longer amount of time, now you may be atypical. Okay. So this is just based off of research. We're not trying to put people in boxes, but women, typically, the longer it's been since they have had sex, their libido will go down, or their craving for sex will go down. We had one of the questions that were turned in was a spouse who was saying that she's not craving as much sex, especially with the deployment happening, but her spouse is. And that's because men will crave it more. So even when you guys are home together, if you're spending longer amounts of time between being intimate with each other, like for females, if you aren't thinking about it, or if you aren't engaged in sexual intimacy, you're going to crave it less. Your libido is going to likely go down, whereas your spouse's is going to go up. Your husband, at least, is going to go up. And that's an important thing for you to know. Yes, Matt.
Yeah. So weighing in on that, Mark Gungor had a very funny thing when he was talking about, but it's true that men have a nothing box. And so I think one of the big differences there is, I know for the supporting spouse that's at home, especially if there are kids in the house, there are so many things happening and there are so many windows open on the mental computer that it's very difficult to shut all those windows in order to begin to focus on the window of pleasure. For men, it's easier to be able to shut all those windows and then to be in a nothing box. And so when you're coming together and you're physically present with one another, it is easier for the man to be able to shut all the windows, be in the nothing box, and be very present in the moment, having not done everything to assist his spouse in shutting all the nothing boxes. And again, we're just talking about a stereotypical male-female relationship. And we know that there's a wealth of other different types of relationships out there. But we can only speak about specifically ours, and we would refer anyone else to go to someone who might be a better expert in a different type of relationship. So,
Well,
but
and
stereotypically, I think that's how it works.
I will also say Dr. Mike Seitzma does a lot of work with sexual discrepancies or sexual, he does a lot of post-affair recovery work, but he also works with spouses that are like the opposite of this, right? So like if you are a female that has the high drive, right? Like there's a lot of content, there's a lot more than you think of content out there if you're outside of the stereotypical that we're talking about. Okay, another thing. Okay, pornography is not recommended while couples are apart. And that's not just Matt and I that are saying that. A lot of marriage and sex experts would agree out there. And the reason why is it comes back to that oxytocin connective hormone. Because when you experience that orgasm, you are connecting to whatever you're associating that sexual experience with. And so we do not, I know there's a lot of stuff out there that's going to say otherwise. And this is just coming from us being experts and having worked with so many marriages where pornography has created so much destruction. Even if you think that for you, it's not a big deal. For a lot of the couples that I work with, it may not be a big deal for you, but it's a huge deal to your spouse. Right. And so there are very few couples that can engage in that in a very healthy way. And so it's actually more destructive because of what you are associating that oxytocin hormone dumping to. Right. And so when you are apart, if you are being creative and you're trying to have those sexual intimacy experiences with your spouse, it's really about making sure that you're doing the best that you can, that you're concentrating on each other and on your own marriage and on your spouse to keep that intimacy and keep that connection where it should be. Okay. So I know that's
but we also want to put in there, you've got the book from Shanti Feldhahn. I don't know if you've got it there.
This one?
The one Through a Man's Eyes.
Oh, I don't have that one in physical
Oh, you
form?
don't have that? Oh yeah, we just got on that digital. That is an incredible read. And so for a female spouse trying to understand her male spouse, That is an incredible read to be able to understand how the male brain actually works and how it functions visually. And a man can say that all day long, but it really helps to have an incredibly great researcher who Shanti Feldhahn is. She's phenomenal. And those two books that you lifted up are highly recommended. But to be able to understand, okay, why is that? And I know that it's also helped us raising two young boys to be able to understand what they're going through in the world, because I can't claim to know what it is to connect with the world through my heart the way I know that my wife could, that she's able to connect with the world through her heart, and that's how she feels and experiences emotion. Whereas for me as a man, her being able to understand that, it's the visual cortex in my brain and the way that I'm wired and the way that it lights up, when I see her smile at me, where I'm just like, oh, my wife's smiling at me. And I just feel like $1,000,000, and when she was talking about the oxytocin from just her eyes, we have this kind of, let you in on a little thing. We have this, like, let me see your smiling eyes. And she just bats her eyes at me. And it's the cutest little thing in the world. But I mean, that's the window into her soul for me, and so visually being able to look into her eyes, it's my world.
Thank you, Laura, for putting Through a Man's Eyes. It does lean a little faith-based, just so that you guys know about that. But I will say it was actually co-written by Shanti Feldhahn, who's a researcher on love and affection and men and women. And she actually co-wrote it with a man who had recovered from an addiction from pornography, and really leads the way in helping men recover from that. And they wrote this book together and helping women especially understand what it's like to be a man. And I cannot recommend that book enough. And so Shanti Feldhahn has also written, these are our favorite books as well, for men only, for women only. Fantastic. I will say that the chapter about women's sexuality is like the best chapter I have ever seen in any book. And just as a quick note, Shanti and her husband wrote these books together. So Shanti wrote the book for men that is talking about women. And Shanti's husband wrote the book about men talking to wives. So that will make a whole lot more sense later. You have to rewind that to understand it. Yeah.
Yes, but it's not just their opinions. So it's not just their perspective.
Research.
They are researchers, and they interviewed, I think, over 25,000 people for those books.
Yes. And if you are recovering or have some big questions about sexuality and some difficulties in sexuality, or you've got some deep hurts, this one by Julie Slattery called Surprised by the Healer. Again, it is a faith-based one, but it's one of the better ones that I've seen. And I will also make sure I revise the listening guide for you guys with some of these resources. All right. We are approaching the end of the hour, and we have questions to go through, and they're very important to us that we get to them. And so you are welcome to stick with us a little bit longer if you can. We're going to get into some of these questions. I do see the one that's in the Q&A that's anonymously submitted, and I'm going to address that one first. And so just know we're going to go a little bit longer if you guys can do that, so we can get into the questions. Yes. So there's 2 questions in the Q&A box already. Okay. If there's any questions on some of what we just covered that is not making sense, please feel free to ask us and we'll clarify as well. Okay. One question is, how could I address insecurities? That's such a broad question. I'm going to answer it broadly if you don't mind. And that is, if you have insecurities, my stance on that is, if I have an insecurity in something, I need to be self-aware and know where that insecurity is coming from. And I'm going to do the hard work, whether I have to go to a professional to do it. One of you submitted the question, how can you reach more military counselors for marriage? The best answer I can give for that is I have the Life Giver directory on my site, life-giver.org, or just lifegiverdirectory.com, is a list of over 200 clinicians, most of them being military spouses and veterans that are clinicians that understand our culture. Go to a counselor. You can search for one of those clinicians. Go to somebody and understand what your insecurities are and where they are coming from. And then I owe it to my husband, I owe it to my spouse to do the best that I can to work on those insecurities as best as I can. I also give myself the grace to know that I'm not going to be perfect and I'm not meant to be a perfect person. And there might be some insecurities that I will always struggle with. But the ones that really hold me back, or the ones that really hold us back in our marriage, are ones that I feel like I really need to address and tackle, and that they're worth doing that. So I hope it's okay that I answered that pretty broadly. The next question is about sex drive that's gone down, especially due to pregnancy. Especially during a deployment, when you had long time being apart and your drive is really low. How do you address coming back together when your spouse's drive is really high, or really excited to be home, right, and your drive is low? Very normal for your libido and your hormones to be all out of whack, especially after pregnancy. But even during a deployment, like we said, if you're a woman and it's been a long time, right, your libido is going to go down. Okay. So my encouragement to you would be, it's going to take a little bit of intentionality here. I definitely would not enter into reintegration accidentally. Okay. It is not in your best interest for either person in marriage to enter reintegration accidentally and hope it all works out. Okay. So if that means that you are spending that extra time, even the few weeks before your spouse is coming back, or maybe maybe you are more intentional now, even if you don't feel like it, right? But just more intentional to start to kind of light that fire just a little bit more. See if you can rekindle some things within yourself, whether it's through thinking or fantasy or educating yourself, or even going to a counselor and talking about it still gets it back on your brain again. And that makes a difference, right? So start to prime things a little bit more. Talk with your spouse, be open with your spouse that you're struggling a little bit, but that you're trying. Talk about your expectations for what reintegration is actually going to look like. But I will say, like, leaning towards your spouse's intimacy language, or leaning towards your spouse's need is always worth it. It's not about putting that pressure and expectation on yourself to be perfect and to be the most sexy person in the world and that you're on fire, right? You're a human being who just had a baby and has now been taking care of a baby. And there's been a lot of like clinging onto you, and you don't feel honestly the most feminine, the most sexy after having a baby and raising toddlers. Okay. So it takes a little bit of that intentionality and work to take care of yourself, get to know yourself a little bit more, communicate with your spouse. And I promise you that if you're patient with yourself, that if you exercise some of that intentionality, it will be a whole lot better. You'll go a lot further than just showing up on accident and hoping it's going to show up when you get there. Yes, Matt.
And for the service member coming home, don't just begin to be intentional about making intimate connections with your spouse just prior to reunion and reintegration. And that's the first one. So continually do it, invest in all those forms of intimacy as much as possible all along the way. And don't only lean into the form of intimacy that you most desire or that you're most craving. We all have a tendency to do that, you know. I mean, if you are denying yourself like sugar, then there comes a time when that's the only thing you can think about is like, you know, and you start walking, you see a bag of M&Ms and you're like, you know, I'm denying myself sugar and I can't have any of that, and that's the only thing I can think about. So it's start thinking about all the other areas of intimacy, investing in that, because part of that priming that happens within a relationship is making sure that there is connection and safety and vulnerability and joy, you know, in all the other areas. When we talk about feeling like you're unsuccessful in one of these areas of intimacy, it's good for couples to encourage one another, especially and to express that gratitude in that area. And I mean, for example, like financial intimacy. If one person is normally the spender and they have started to become more thrifty, more investing, and it's out of their character and out of their nature, then to express your gratitude that they're now speaking your love language and they're now speaking to that part of your intimacy. And they're intentionally doing that to show you that they have suppressed their own desire or their own want or wish of being able to go out and do this in service to make the other person feel those good, positive feelings that we want to do in a marriage.
Cannot stress that enough, guys, as you are working on this in your relationship, to point out like when your spouse is trying, when your spouse is making an effort, what they're doing right. Too often marriages get to a point where we're only like saying what we're not getting and what you're not doing right. And most people are trying. Most people are trying. There was a question about some practical tips for fostering faith-based sexual intimacy during long durations apart. There's spiritual intimacy, and then there's sexual intimacy, and then there's like kind of a faith-based approach. I'm also hearing that you're lining your values in there with your sexual intimacy. If you're wanting to grow in that area, faith-based resource would be Passion Pursuit is a study that you can do that's faith-based for women. But definitely talking about how your spirituality impacts your sexuality and how it impacts your physical intimacy. And recognize too, also that I see a lot of couples that I'm going to be stereotypical here again, but the wife wants to connect in a spiritual, emotional way. And then their husband wants to connect in a physical way. And they hit this like clash of like, feeling like neither one of them is speaking their language. And so therefore we're just going to go to opposite corners and be in a stalemate. And really what we're trying to say here is that those two work together, right? And that it's okay that your spouse, men do experience connection and love and feeling and feeding their own security, and feeling wanted and feeling respected as a man and experiencing their own manhood all comes through physical intimacy, right? And so we can't deny that completely and say, no, unless you meet my needs emotionally, right? There has to be a working together and understanding that they talk to each other, okay? So make sure you're communicating, do a study. I cannot stress, if you're looking for a faith-based approach here, Julie Slatterly has Authentic Intimacy. That's the Passion Pursuit. Great things on their site for plenty of faith-based stuff. The researcher that we mentioned for women having the higher libido would be Dr. Michael Sytsma, Sytsma. He has a website called Building Intimate Marriages or intimatemarriage.org, where he has a few articles on there as well, and some really good stuff there. Okay. We're doing great. Stick with us if you still have questions that you want answered. Here's some questions that were submitted to us that kind of really get into, I would say, the gritty of things, if you will. So one of the questions, I'd like to go back to that question about, the question was, I don't crave sex the way my spouse does. So when he's away, I don't miss it, but I know he does. How can I let my spouse know that I'm not comfortable with cyber sex when he's away? So that's a big question. We've kind of covered a little bit how it's normal for some people for their libido to go down when you're spending that time away. I think this is really a question of, and this comes up a lot, it's the question of, what if my spouse wants to do something that's uncomfortable to me? Right? That's the question here. And so Matt and I talked about this beforehand, before our talk today. Here's where I would come from on this. Whenever I get a question of like, because I don't want to assume here, but sometimes behind that question is a who's right and who's wrong. Is he asking too much, or is she asking too little, or wants to do too little? Like there's like who's right, who's wrong. And I have this picture in my mind of this couple like in those opposite corners. And so one of the first things that I do in my mind is I kind of like paint a picture of a spectrum, right? And I look at like a line and I ask myself like, okay, in order to figure out where's a healthy answer here of what's healthy in a relationship, the first thing that I ask myself is, well, if I'm looking for what's healthy, then what's destructive? Like, what is my, let me give you another metaphor that Matt and I were talking ahead of time, where I want you to picture a road, like you're driving down a road and it's a road that has guardrails, right? And in marriage, one of the most important things for any area of your marriage, especially when it comes to these types of intimacy, comes down to your shared values. It is what you both agree on together are your values. And those are your guardrails in your relationship, right? And usually the guardrails on a highway are your deal breakers, right? Like if you hit that guardrail is there because they're saying whatever's past that guardrail, you don't want to go there. right? It is dangerous for you to go there. Every morning I drive my kids to school, I cross this dam, and on one side is a lake and on one side is a cliff. Like that, those guardrails are really important, right? And so in your relationship, you should have in your mind, what are your guardrails? What are your deal breakers, right? And then inside those guardrails is like the shoulder of the road, right? And when your tire, like when you're not paying attention and your tire crosses the line and it gets to the shoulder, that's uncomfortable, right? It's kind of too close to the guardrail. There are some topics and issues in your marriage where your spouse, it's in the middle of the road and it's fine for them and it's not a big deal. Let's say your spouse wants cyber sex, right? And for him, he's saying cyber sex is healthy. It's a way for us to connect. It's a way for me to feel close to you. But for you, that's on the shoulder, right? That's on the shoulder where it's like, oh, this is like, I don't know if this is a direction that I can go. It's important for you to be able to articulate that with your spouse, but it's important for you to know where the guardrails are so you can articulate with each other, what are my deal breakers? And usually deal breakers have more to do with values than creativity and ideas in your relationship. Okay. So the first answer to this question, which I think will address a lot of your questions, is what are your guardrails? What are your deal breakers? For some of you out there, if you have a past, past with sexual trauma in it, right? You're going to have some very important deal breakers for you that are very difficult, or the shoulder of your road, especially when it comes to sexual intimacy, might be a little bit wider, where it's areas that you're trying to go into that aren't necessarily deal breakers, but they're really uncomfortable for you, right? These are all important conversations to have with your spouse, to be able to clearly articulate what's a definite no and is a deal breaker versus what's on the shoulder versus what's towards the center of the line. Yes, Matt.
So one of the things that came up when you were saying that in my brain was, it's not only two things. You need to know your why and to be able to articulate your why and to speak with authority about yourself. And too often we don't know what our why is. And the second thing is it is healthy for a marriage to be able to have the freedom to be able to discuss what these guardrails are and what's free chicken, what's free game happening in the middle of the road. And on that masterclass, it was a yes, no, maybe. The person that was speaking said, creating a yes, no, maybe list. And so to be able to share that, I find it very interesting that I run across a lot of people that want to be comfortable with engaging in different sexual activity, but they're completely uncomfortable talking about it. And how can you be, and this is my question, how can you be comfortable like doing it and not talking about it? And that's the way I raised both my boys when we had the talk. I was like, look, before you ever become comfortable doing it, you need to become comfortable talking about it, because that's the way adults are. I mean, to be able to express your inner world. So we almost have to tease out sexual intimacy between the actions that are involved within sexual intimacy between two people and the ability to discuss what is on somebody's heart and on their mind and why that is meaningful to them. But you also have to know yourself. So early on, people get imprinted on, and men typically do get these imprintings of things you experience or things you see early on, and they don't know why. It's just there. And so they constantly go back to that to try and figure that out. But they're not able to articulate if it's meaningful, why it's meaningful, to what degree something is meaningful to them. And so to the question of, being uncomfortable with cyber sex, it's very powerful to be able to articulate your why, and it doesn't mean that somebody can then just has the freedom to try and talk you out of that why. That's your why. You get to own that, and stand on that. But you still have to be able to express it. And I believe that when we express our why to one another in any of these areas of intimacy, the way that we're respected, the way that it's honored, the way that it's held, the way that it's cared for, actually takes us to a deeper level of intimacy.
Right.
That we can be able to say, this is meaningful for these reasons. I want to save money for these reasons, because I know you want to go out and spend money all the time, but I'm actually thinking about, I want to retire with you and own land and live on a house and sit on a front porch and us not ever have to work again, and us go, can you have that little bit of delayed gratification until we can get to that place? And being able to articulate that casts vision. It helps the other person dream. So it engages your brain, it engages your imagination, and gives you a deeper meaning behind what it is. So when you're having that conversation, be able to articulate why it's uncomfortable for you, and then be able to openly listen to why it's meaningful to him. And once you get to a deeper level of that understanding, then there may be some level ground inside those guardrails where you both can be able to connect, sexually from a distance.
Well, and that's the power of having that yes, no, maybe list, is that sometimes we just think in yes and no's. And I mean, it can clear up a lot on whether or not something's a maybe, or maybe it's a no, not yet. There's a lot of like, it's a conversation starter more than anything else. But by the way, Dr. Doug Rosenau would say that if you're uncomfortable with talking about it, he actually recommends couples just like reading his book out loud as a way to have that first step of talking and saying all those words out loud that maybe you're not used to, is an exercise he actually asks a lot of couples to do. All right, really important question that comes up all the time for couples that are apart, the way the military pulls us apart, which is, we got actually two questions that address this. Let's see, how do you sustain a long distance relationship without cheating or allowing another friendship to get in the way? Somebody else had submitted a question about can you have friends of the opposite sex? All right. In order to address this, we want you to know that in your listening guide, this is so important. We have included, and we're not going to go through it in detail today, but we wanted to give you the 12 steps that lead to an affair. It is in your listening guide. It's on the back page, I believe, that we gave you the 12 steps that lead to an affair. It is so important during your time apart. All the time we're protecting our marriages. I would say a majority of the couples that come to me for counseling are in post-affair or post-betrayal recovery, whether it's financial, emotional, or physical betrayal that's happened. And so a lot of times it's because we're not actively protecting our relationship from the beginning. So Matt and I would say, for sure, can you have friends that are the opposite sex? Yes. However, there need to be very clear rules and very clear expectation and understanding around those friends of the opposite sex. There are very few friends that Matt and I have that we would trust with me spending any kind of time with that male friend, right? So for example, we have some great friends. We actually asked to come here to Fort Hood because they were close by. They're like our family, if you will. And we knew that they would be the support for our family during a deployment. And it's because Matt trusts that husband so much. He trusts him with our kids and with me, and I trust them as a couple as well. And so, for example, we have people coming in to paint our house, and I needed to take down our TV. And so Matt said, why don't you call him and ask him to come over and help with that TV? But it's a good example of, number one, I have Matt's blessing on that. Number two, I would not ask that husband to come over and help me with that without his wife knowing about it. And so there's like a shared understanding when you have friends of the opposite sex that you are always making sure that that spouse is looped in to conversations, that there's no side conversations happening, that you're not going and having dinner or lunch or something that he would even be perceived as something that's not appropriate, that you are being highly protective of your relationship at all times, especially when you are apart. And that there's that shared understanding. It was, who was the guy? It was at Gungor who talked about that in marriage, to protect your relationship, that you learn to be appropriately rude with people of the opposite sex. It's, you're not being impolite. You're just keeping that guard. Go ahead, Matt.
So I know that where Corie and I are coming from may come across as very old school, or may even seem rather draconian. Just take it from two people that have spent the better part of 20 years counseling people post-affair and post-betrayal, trying to recover their marriages. The number one thing that everybody says, it is all I don't know how this happened.
Yeah.
I don't know how it happened. It was an accident. It just started like this. It had every single one of them. So for us, this is just the rules that we make for our marriage out of respect. And in all honesty, my wife fills all my friend needs like more than I need any other friend. Right. And so I don't really need another friend. I don't really want to spend any. I mean, if I'm going to spend any extra time hanging out with anybody, it's going to be her. Right. And so I'm kind of like, I'm sorry, I don't need another friend. I've got all the friend that I have in my wife. And if I'm going to be spending any of that extra time, it's going to be with her or sending her an email or connecting with her, because my connection with her is my number one priority in life. And there will be nothing that will ever come in between that.
Well, and there is questions. I do get questions a lot about like, should my spouse be my best friend? And my answer would be like, I think so, but there is a place for your village, for your community of other friends to fill the need for community. Like, I do think that that's important. But when it comes to intimacy, when you look through those 12 steps that lead to an affair, this is how it starts. Number one, it always starts with a selfish, I deserve mentality. It's, you know what, this deployment is hard, so I deserve to like be able to have an adult conversation. Your next question should be with who? Right? And making sure that I'm protecting my relationship and protecting my marriage, and that I don't even do anything that looks like it could be inappropriate. But I will tell you, affairs always start with, I deserve fill in the blank. Okay. The second thing that is, there's a lot of like areas of a slippery slope there. But I will say that the step, and by the way, it's at number 4 or 5 of 12, is where an emotional affair happens. So what you have to be aware of what's happening in those first 5 steps, because if the start of an emotional affair is that you share your emotions with someone else when you should be sharing those emotions with your spouse, that's the start of an emotional affair. When you're sharing personal emotions, especially about your relationship with someone else, that's getting into a slippery slope of an emotional affair. And so what you have to ask yourself is, wow, well, what are all the other steps that happen before that, so that I am aware of what could happen if I'm not protective of my relationship? There's also other rules that are important of being like, just being transparent with your spouse, digital transparency, all those kinds of things. We're going to cover a little bit more how to heal and recover from some of these wounds in a future webinar. So make sure you're watching for these webinars coming out. The next one is going to be on communication. Then we're going to talk about healing those deep wounds that happen in your relationship. Often, a lot of those wounds happen when you're apart because you're not on guard protecting your relationship. Protecting your relationship can be about protecting it from the temptation of those outside of your relationship, but protecting your relationship can also be, am I being intentional to keep this relationship strong? Okay. All right. So we're going to wrap it up here in just a second. I saw that, Laura. I think the last question I think I'd like for us to cover, Matt, because there's so many we could cover, guys. So many. Yeah. The last question I think is about care packages and how to stay connected in those kind of creative ways. You know, one of my favorite things to do when Matt's deployed is I always send him something that's got my perfume on it, because it took me a while to realize that there is no like physical affection of handshakes and, you know, guy hugs that are happening during deployment. Right. And so there's a lot of, I think, skin hunger and a lot of multisensory lack of connection that can definitely happen for especially the service members. And so giving even just that scent, I think, is powerful. I remember during one of my first deployments, like just smelling his cologne was like a huge connection that can happen. So just remember, like when you share even something like a scent in that way, it lights up the memory sensors in your mind. All the 5 senses light up in your mind, and you go back to a shared experience that you had together, and you'll immediately feel that connection again. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, you said shared experiences, but I was already moving in that direction, where it doesn't always have to be something of like an affection nature. Sometimes it's like, you know, I was out here and was able to go by a Starbucks and find 2 little, you know, Corie and I collect Starbucks. You have one probably on your desk there, don't you? From a different Starbucks.
Yeah.
And so was able to collect a Starbucks cup. Yep. That was when I went to NTC and I had to drive somebody to Los Angeles. And so it's that memory of like, hey, I'm going to stop by, I'm going to grab this, and this will be a memory. And so I was able to grab a couple of Starbucks cups, and I've got those to be able to send home to her. The other part of the care packages, and I know we got to wrap it up, is it does take time to sit and be intentional, but there is a connection in sitting and thinking about the other. And really paying attention to that shared experience of going, wait a minute, it's not just what's in front of me right now or how I'm feeling right now. What could I do? What could I send that would remind that person of a very deep and meaningful shared experience that we have, so that when it's sitting there on their desk or in their Humvee or right next to their tent, when they see that, they think of a very deep, meaningful shared experience they had with me, and they automatically go back because it was a deep shared sensory experience. They automatically go back to how it felt and what they experienced. And we as humans can re-experience that feeling through a thought, through a smell, through a sight, through something that's tangible that we can touch, where we're like, okay, there's a real person on the other end of this. Yeah.
So I think to kind of sum up and answer this question, like, how do you build a strong relationship? Because this was another question, how do you build a strong relationship over long distance? And I think without letting those things creep in that can pull you apart, whether it is the temptation of another relationship or whether it's just busyness, right? I think the answer to this is when you especially have a very important kind of intimacy that is challenging when you're apart, in this case, to be physical intimacy, right? Leaning on, like, not neglecting that one completely, but leaning on some of the other types and being as intentional as possible during your relationship is so important. And I hope that that's what you guys are walking away with, is that there are lots of ways that you can be intentional, and you might lean on a different intimacy type a little bit more while you're apart than what you would normally do when you're together. And so Matt and I have been talking this whole time during the series about how we're using the day one journal to every day we both write to each other. And that has taken great intentionality. On days that I've been super tired, there was one day I even just did a video where I didn't even type it, but there was some kind of intentional communication because we wanted to exercise that muscle a little bit. We had stopped writing each other because we were around each other all the time. So that was an area we wanted to grow. There is the care packages that you can send back and forth to each other. There is the intellectual conversations that you can have. There is leaning towards your spouse's intimacy type, even though it may not necessarily be yours. I'm just going to say that it's a thing nowadays for spouses to consider, even boudoir pictures. So just to help with those pictures so that your spouse isn't tempted towards pornography, that they're built to be a visual man, right? And so gifting them with something that is visual, that at least keeps that connection alive, can be a powerful thing. And it can be very uncomfortable, but there's ways that you can do that safely and in a way that makes you feel good. And so the issue here is more about you guys being intentional in whatever area you need to be intentional in. And it's a great time to work on areas that are really challenging for you. And it's also a really great time when you're apart to go and get professional help, or to pick up those books that you normally would be afraid to pick up while you're together. The pressure is maybe off a little bit while you're going through this time of separation. So you don't have the daily conversation or the daily pressure to perform or to get it right or to fight about it or whatever. So use this time to actually grow and change and invest in that area that's challenging for you so that you can grow a little bit as you go along. Okay. Laura, I know that we need to cut our time. Thank you guys so much for sticking with us longer than we anticipated. Most of you guys were able to stick around. This will be recorded, and very soon we will have an audio version too. If you're not kind of the video person and you want to just listen to the audio, we'll have those coming soon. Thank you guys for your great questions. I hope that this was helpful to you. We could have gone on forever, right? But I hope that we answered some of the questions that you guys had. So Laura, thank you so much for